This Week in Startups is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. A business is only as strong as its people, and every hire matters. Post your first job for free at linkedin.com/twist. Vanta. Compliance and security shouldn't be a deal breaker for startups to win new business. Vanta makes it easy for companies to get a SOC 2 report fast. Twist listeners can get $1,000 off for a limited time at vanta.com/twist. And DigitalOcean's App Platform, a new platform-as-a-service solution to build modern, cloud-native apps. With App Platform, you can build, deploy, and scale apps and static websites quickly and easily. Use App Platform for free and receive a $100 credit for any upgrade at do.co/twist. That's do.co/twist.
Hey everybody, welcome to This Week in Startups. Today on the program, we're going to talk with basically the nicest guy at the New York Times, who is also become the most hated person at the second most hated person at the New York Times by the tech industry. You can tell by my laughter that I'm joking. Cade Metz is back on the program because he's got a new book out. And because he did a little story that went somewhat viral, and we should just get into it.
It struck a nerve. That's the way I prefer to think about it.
So you've been on the pod before. I know you as an intelligent, considered, kind, dare I say soft-spoken, intellectual. You wrote a piece about Slate Star Codex, which I've heard of exactly prior to your whole brouhaha and the Donnybrook that ensued. I think I had heard about them maybe 4 times from the Peter Thiel, A16Z, I don't know what you call those dark web kind of thinkers, libertarian, I don't know.
There are a lot of names for it, and that's what the piece is about, right? It's about this mindset, and we'll go into that.
Yeah. How did you first become aware of this blog, the SSC, Slate Star Codex?
That's right. Well, I've covered AI for a long time. First at Wired magazine, where I was for about 5 or 6 years, and then I moved to the Times about 3.5 years ago. And if you cover AI, the blog comes up every now and again, right? As I describe in the piece, it's at this point, the epicenter, let's call it, of a community called the Rationalists. And this community focuses on AI in many respects. And it's one of the communities in various parts of the globe that believes AI is a real danger, that it could, in fact, destroy humanity one day. That's one of the central beliefs. And so if you cover AI like me, every now and again, you get a link to Slate Star Codex. You develop sources and you have friends who read this on a daily basis. We're talking blog posts that are 8,000 words long, and there are people who read every single word of it. And they show
well written? Is it well written, and is it intellectually coherent? Do you find it appealing to read it?
It depends who you're talking to.
Well, I'm talking to you.
Okay,
yeah.
This is one of the things I'm sure we will discuss ad nauseum. I'm a New York Times reporter, right? So my aim when it comes to writing a story about this or writing a book, I am not a player, right? At least
you're objective. Your goal is to be objective.
If I can help it, right? I don't want to be in the story. With this story, I had to be in there, unfortunately. But I do want to, even if I'm in the story, be an objective, neutral point in the story, and I want to tell the story with fairness and rigor. And so it's not about my opinion, it's about everyone else's opinion. Let me tell you, opinion is divided on whether even it's coherent.
So you and I are part of a group of journalists that were trained, I think, in the 90s. I don't know when you started. I'm 50 now. I think you might be the same age as me.
A little bit younger, but yeah.
A little bit younger, okay. You come across as much more considered and mature than me. So you're a Gen Xer.
Yes.
And we were taught, hey, straight down the middle, your opinion doesn't matter. The facts are what matter. The facts tell the story. You would admit, I think, you would concede that the journalists in this I'm painting with a broad brush here, but journalism has become more opinionated, where people pick a side and maybe do what I would consider more advocacy journalism. Do you think that's the trend? More opinion is inserted, and we are the old school to this new school version of journalism?
You definitely see that, right?
Yeah.
And what bothers me is that all journalism gets painted with the same brush, right? So there's this wide range, and there's always been a wide range, right? We've been talking about yellow journalism, since William Randolph Hearst and before. Yeah. And, what ends up happening is that as people, embrace journalism as an advocate, then, the New York Times gets accused of this, and everyone gets accused of this. And I can speak for my own work. I can speak for the Times work to a certain extent. But, that's where it gets dicey, is when, people have an issue with certain types of journalism and then seem to see that in another type of journalism.
Got it. Would you concede as well? Because I'm setting up this line of questioning because I think you and I are simpatico, and I just want to sort of lay the groundwork here. And it's super inside baseball, but I think nobody's really had a rational discussion about your piece. And nobody, certainly from my side of the table, because I am a Silicon Valley living investor in technology companies, but I also started my career as a journalist for 15 years. So I feel like I might be able to help navigate this just a wee bit. Would you also concede that younger people are more interested in advocacy journalism than what I'll call the neutral straight shot journalism that you and I were, trained on?
Not necessarily. So that people make that claim a lot, right? A journalist is a journalist, whatever age they are.
Okay.
And of course, we're going to see differences from generation to generation. We're going to see differences from different parts of the country, different parts of the world.
Okay.
But I have colleagues who are much better at this than me, who are much younger than me.
Got it.
And I have colleagues who are older, who do things differently than I do, and who do things differently than the New York Times. It's a wide range.
Would you say that the Trump presidency had an impact on journalism where journalists felt they needed to take a stand? And because I do think that this might be part of the contentiousness, which I seem to feel like got very acute during the Trump presidency, that people said, you know what? I normally wouldn't have an opinion, but I need to make an opinion now because this person is an authoritarian, a liar, and hey, this could be the next Hitler, or we really are fighting for democracy here. So now is the time to not be precious and be a straight down the middle journalist. Now is the time to actually advocate for what is right. Did you feel that that was a general thing that happened over the Trump presidency?
I think there are two things that happened. That's one of them, right? You see people do that. I'm not going to deny that. You see people at other publications from my own who certainly do that. The other thing is that in the past, and as a Gen Xer who's been covering the technology industry for a long time, I started out as a researcher in New York at PC Magazine, which was... Oh,
really?
Yes.
Wow. PC Magazine. Ziff Davis. On Park Avenue and 32nd Street.
You got it. 1 Park Avenue.
I know it. I've been in the building.
That was my first job right out of college. I came to New York with no job, and I was hired as a researcher, which meant I fact-checked stories. And
wow, fact-checking. Whoa.
Fact-check back in the day when you had money
when people
to do
had
that,
money
right?
for fact-checking.
You got it.
And also the cadence, let's be honest, we were monthly, it's in the name, right? Or weekly or a daily. There was actually a little bit of time for fact-checking. In this new on-demand world, fact-checking is just not as much of a practice.
It's true.
Sadly.
But there are other ways to fact check, and we can talk about that too if you want. But what
well, we will unpack that one for sure. But Jim Seymour, John Dvorak,
I know all those guys. Michael Miller was
the editor in chief. When I met Michael Miller when I was coming into the industry at PC Forum or one of those, I was shaking. In the 80s, I grew up reading his column. Jim Seymour, rest in peace. John Dvorak. Who were the other columnists? There were like 4 columnists. Yeah,
Bill Howard was a long time one. There's another Bill who I'm blanking on, but those,
it was incredible. And you had the lab. You guys would benchmark PCs versus each other in their speed test.
Had one in New York, one on the West Coast in Foster City. And my point, though, is that, from there I worked up to be a writer at PC Magazine. I later moved to a very different publication called The Register.
Register, adversarial tech journalism from the UK. Can't get any advertisers. Bites the hand that feeds them.
Bites the hand that feeds them. And look,
is that literally their tagline?
That is literally the tagline. Here, my point with The Register, great training ground for reporters. And it might not seem that way.
Why?
Well, let me explain it to you. Let me tell you who came out of there. Ashley Vance, who's at Bloomberg Business Week. He was my colleague for 2 years. One of the best reporters I know. Dan Gooden, another incredible reporter who has been at Business 2.0, and he's now at ours, and he was at the Wall Street Journal. Chris Williams, who went on to write for some great British newspapers. The list goes on. The reason why it's a great training ground is that it forces you to go around the companies. The companies will not talk to you.
Yeah, the Register calls, you just block.
Block. So you could get nothing, which meant you had to build the story yourself, right?
Go to sources.
You had to build the real story. Now, my point is that, so I've seen both sides of it. I've seen the PC Magazine side, and let me just be frank about this, right? There were times when the directive was, don't get the advertisers mad. You better not be critical here, right? Yep. That's wrong. That is not.
Let's just say there wasn't a Chinese wall, or if there was, it wasn't that high. You can step over it.
And,
they did.
Right. At various times in my career, right, there is, whether it's spoken or not, there's a directive to be more optimistic and that kind of thing. And, as you said before, as a journalist, your aim should be something different, right? Your aim should be to step back and look at this thing and look at the reality of it. And so what I have seen, and this is a long way of asking your question, but I've seen everything over the years. What I think has happened also recently is that the tech industry, as it grew up over the past couple of decades, it got a lot of favorable coverage. And that was sort of the way it worked, right? Is that you sort of presented what you wanted to a lot of these publications, and you got what you wanted. And then at some point that started to change, right? But I would argue, before you ask the next question, it needed to change in that respect, right?
The new year is here, and that marks a fresh start for your small business. We're hiring a bunch of people at launch in 2021. We need a second producer, a third video editor, a community manager, operations people, and more. Things are going gangbusters for us. The podcast is sold out. We're going to 3, 4, 5 days a week. The syndicate is blowing up in a good way, and our fund is hard at work doing the launch accelerator, so we need help. And you know where we're going to find the most qualified candidates? You know it. I know it. We all know it. LinkedIn Jobs, of course. We love using LinkedIn Jobs at launch because we can manage all of our job postings and contact candidates from a single view. Whether you're shifting business hours or hiring more remote employees, one thing that remains unchanged is the importance of having the right people on your team. When your business is ready to make that next hire, LinkedIn Jobs can help by matching your role with qualified candidates so that you can find the right person quickly. LinkedIn now has over 722 million members worldwide, and they mean business. So post a job with targeted screening questions, and LinkedIn will quickly get your role in front of the most qualified candidates. You need speed and you need quality. Speed and quality. And that's what LinkedIn Jobs is all about. When your business is ready to make that next hire, find the right person with LinkedIn Jobs. And now you can post your job for free. Just visit linkedin.com/twist and post your job for free. You have to use that special URL, linkedin.com/twist, TWIST, for a free job posting right now. Terms and conditions, of course, apply. I'm not going to disagree with you. I think, having been there for it, and I did Silicon Alley Reporter, as you know, in the 90s, and I was considered more closer to the register than, a cheerleader. Although some people said I was a cheerleader. I was more an interested party, I think, because I ran the publication in a very Machiavellian way. I actually picked the winners and losers. I took a Jan Wenner or Graydon Carter approach, which was bring me all the stories and I'll spike whatever story I don't like and I'll tell you which story to write and I'll pick who's on the cover and I'm going to pick the headlines. And it was more me with a bunch of people supporting my worldview, which is unique in publications as well. But you are correct. And I think part of it was the nature of technology was it would be introduced and it would make our lives better. And I think up until that point in time, airbags and PCs and GPS and whatever technology we found, digital cameras, MP3 players, laser printers, they all added to our lives. It was hard to find a moment in time where any of those technologies were having an adverse effect. Name a technology before 2000 that you felt had a horrible effect on life. Can you think of one? I'm trying to think of one.
Yeah.
Hacking, video games, I don't know. They all seemed quite nice.
There are always drawbacks to technology. Whatever time period you're in, there are positives and there are negatives. And a lot of it depends on who you are and how you see things. But I will say that technology is getting more complicated.
Yes.
Certainly.
See, this is key.
Right? It is key.
If I asked you before 2000, what's the worst impact you saw firsthand with technology, and then after 2000,
right.
I think it would be two different size lists and two different magnitudes. Let's do it right now. Post 2000, what's the worst you saw in technology?
Well,
from a technology company.
No, well, again, my aim is to stand in the middle here, but
what would most people say were the downsides to technology post 2000? Not you or me, but most people. Social media comes to mind off the top of my head.
Well, look, anyone who's lived over the past 4 years has seen the effect of social media on their daily lives, right? Yes. I was just talking with a friend of mine, who's running a Facebook group over the past 10 years, and he saw how it changed, and he saw how people reacted differently. He saw how the algorithms would push certain things and not push others in ways that he did not expect, in ways that a lot of the creators of this technology did not expect, right?
Right.
Or
did not care.
Right.
Potentially.
There are all different things, all sorts of things going on here. And then so the job of the journalist is to look at all that, right? The job of the journalist is to look at where these things are going wrong, where they might go wrong. And as the technology gets more complicated, and we're going to see this more and more in the years to come.
Sure.
Facebook is relatively simple when it comes, relative to a lot of this AI stuff that I talk about in my book and how that has evolved and how it will continue to evolve and how it could exacerbate a lot of these problems we're now dealing with.
And I forgot to say, the name of the book, Genius Makers, The Mavericks Who Brought AI to Google, Facebook, and the World, which is coming out right now. It should be out. So go buy it, buy the audiobook, buy the book, and we'll get into that in the second half of this episode. So I think we're kind of in agreement and alignment. There wasn't really a lot of downside to the tech early. It's gotten when it hit scale, and because of AI, because of the feed, and specifically because of one company, Facebook, which I believe is a bad actor in the whole space. I think Mark Zuckerberg is a bad actor. I can have that opinion. You're a journalist. You might not have that same opinion. But I believe he over and over and over again, when he faced an ethical or a moral dilemma, he picked what would grow the company, not what would grow society or what would protect people. He always picked his own self-interest of removing friction and making the monstrosity that is Facebook, that Frankenstein of a horrible monster that he created. He only wanted it to grow. And that amoral nature of Zuckerberg, I believe, was the moment that somebody pissed in the well of technology and poisoned it for the whole village. That's what I think was a turning point in the industry, was his personal bad behavior. I'm going to put that aside for now. That's my opinion, not yours. But let's wrap up the blog post. Okay, you find this blog. It's well read amongst the AI community. It's not well read amongst Silicon Valley. So when I saw the title of the piece, and it said Silicon Valley's Safe Space. Was that the title of the?
That's right.
Did you write that title? No. Okay, great. I know the answer. I'm a poker player. If you take that long to answer and you look up, I can tell you didn't write it.
Well,
let me ask another way. Do you stand by that title?
Of course, I stand by every word in that story.
But no, did you write the title or not?
Did I write it?
Yeah,
I honestly don't remember, but it is certainly. I think it's a great title, and
catchy.
I stand by every word in that story. If you read the story,
I've read the story, but hold on. I just want to start. Let me just start with the title here, though, because I think it's important for people to understand. And I'm kind of advocating for you in this one. Okay. So take the win.
All right.
I know you didn't write that title. And I know that New York Times journalists don't write their titles in overwhelming number of cases. They get written by editors and by now a social media group that is looking for clicks. And it is designed by a different group of people than the journalists who write the stories. This is true, yes.
No. My editors and I choose the title. Okay, this is not
the titles are chosen to get clicked, correct?
No. The titles are chosen by me and my editors, no one else. And it's the best title for the story. And let me point out here.
Best defined how? Accurate or appealing to lure the reader in? What are you guys thinking about when you write a title?
You're thinking about all sorts of things. But if you think that the aim of the New York Times
entitling stories
is to get clicks, you have never been inside the New York Times. It is astonishing to people who haven't been in that the currency is not how many clicks you get.
You're telling me people at the New York Times don't get paid by their social media following and how many clicks they get for their stories?
No, we don't.
Okay, you don't think Kara Swisher's deal is based on her Twitter following?
So this is a great thing you bring up because this is one way I want to convey, what's going on.
And she's a friend of mine and she's worth every penny. I mean, they're paying her $1 million a year to do those podcasts, I'm sure. She's not an employee. I understand that. And podcasts are slightly different. And you guys got your asses kicked with the Caliphate podcast.
No, but there is a difference. And I understand why this is hard for people to grasp, or if they don't grasp it. I understand why. There is a newsroom where I work. I'm a reporter, and we have editors in the newsroom, and we have strict rules, a lot of which we've talked about, during the course of this podcast. Separate from that, there is an opinion section.
Yes.
Kara is on the opinion side. Right. She writes op-eds. That has nothing to do with
What percentage of users do you think understand the difference today?
I don't know what percentage it is, but a lot of them don't understand it. But what I will say is
whose responsibility is it then to correct that misunderstanding? The readers or the New York Times?
When we publish an op-ed, the first word in the headline is opinion, right? Okay. We clearly identify its opinion, but people still don't understand that there's a difference between what I do and what Kara does. Do
you feel that the New York Times could do better at this in really making sure we both know the audience doesn't know the difference in most cases. I would say the majority of cases. And we both know that the opinion is gone wildly to the left and that there really isn't a space for right-leaning opinions at the New York Times opinion page anymore. So do you think the New York Times opinion page going so far left and not having room for right voices makes your job harder? Because it exacerbates this image that the New York Times has gone full MSNBC, even though it's not accurate.
I can tell you, in all honesty, I don't think about the opinion section. That is separate from me. And people are always coming to me and asking me questions like that. And they want introductions to people. All I can say is I work in the newsroom, and that's my focus.
So that is incredibly magnanimous of you. I think the New York Times reporters who are on the news side resent and are disturbed by the fact that the opinion page has gone just buck wild and can't even keep someone like Bari Weiss, who is, barely on the right or, barely right-leaning, and that you can't keep that balance there. And I think it makes your job a lot harder, but that's my opinion, not yours. And I think it's why the New York Times is losing its status as the paper of record is because the opinion page has gone buck wild. I think because of the Trump derangement syndrome, which I think I suffered a little bit from, I'll be totally honest. Like, I was appalled by the Trump presidency. It really disturbed me. I'm not afraid to say that. If you weren't disturbed by Trump, I think there's something wrong with you. Like, his behavior was so disturbing that having Trump derangement syndrome, probably the logical thing, like given what he did to this country and how, he got a couple things right, maybe. Hey, everybody, I thought I would bring Christina Cacioppo. I pronounced it correct, I'm hoping, Christina?
You got it, yep.
All right, you're the founder of Vanta. People have been hearing your ads on the pod for the last year, and I thought it'd be fun to have you on and you to explain why you created Vanta and what SOC 2 is and why it's important people get it right. So let's start with, what is SOC 2 for people who are just realizing they have to become SOC 2 compliant?
For sure. So SOC 2 is, at a high level, it's sort of a customer asking you to prove your security.
Now, these audit firms that you partner with, you prepare everything, but you still need to have an auditor. So who gets the auditor, you or the company that is engaging Vanta?
Yeah, absolutely. So one part of what we do at Vanta is we've built a network of audit firms, and there's a couple dozen we work with today. So we're happy to broker introductions, help companies kind of choose what sort of auditor or firm would be best for them. And then the other part of the pitch is, that auditor knows Vanta, understands and trusts our data. And so the audit will be faster and cheaper if one of our network firms are used.
All right, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for coming on and telling the audience why you should get your SOC 2, when you should get it, and how you should do it. And you've been very nice to our audience, giving them $1,000 off, which is a really significant and generous offer. Go to vanta.com/twist, vanta.com/twist to get $1,000 off your SOC 2. Thanks, Christina. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Cheers now. All right, so let's get into the story, because here's where I think it gets hard for you. I believe that you tried to do this straight down the middle. And I think I kind of know you, and I definitely know your archetype as a journalist, because I consider myself part of that. And I candidly hired people like you specifically to do what you do. Like, you're the old school. Now that we're Gen Xers, we're old school. There's 2 generations behind us who have a lot to say about us. We're almost boomer territory now. But I think that this specific story becomes very difficult for you to navigate because everybody assumes that it's a hit piece. You did not have an agenda where you wanted to dox this individual or uncover their identity. You just wanted to tell the story of the most influential AI blog in the world. Am I correct?
Well, let me step back a little bit from that.
Yeah.
So you brought up the title, right? Silicon Valley Safe Space. You know why that's a great title?
Because that's why I forgot why I found it offensive. I am as connected as anybody in this place. I'm the most connected in all likelihood. Like top 10 most connected people here. Very few people read it. It is not Silicon Valley Safe Space. It's an inaccurate title. It's a safe space for like 20 people who are Peter Thiel's minions and, that whole circle of Balaji and Andreessen Horowitz and all those weirdos.
Does the title refer to the blog? No. The title is Silicon Valley Safe Space. It's talking about a subset of Silicon Valley, okay? Uh-huh. And that is undeniable. There's this certain mindset among, you're right, a subsection of people in the world and in Silicon Valley, and that's what I'm trying to do. And this blog is a window into that mindset, and it ends up talking about a whole lot of different people and groups. And there's a lot of names for this mindset. You alluded to this, right? You can call them the rationalists, or there are people who self-identify as the intellectual dark web.
So weird.
The Lunar Society on Clubhouse. There are all sorts of names for this. Okay,
who are these people? Let's describe the people, because we're going to disagree about how the title is interpreted, and of course, this is a Rashomon type issue. There's 5 versions of the truth because we all have a different angle. From my angle, I was like, oh my God. Cade is painting with this brush that I think this way. I don't think like these weirdos from Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen's libertarians. I'm kind of libertarian, but I don't think like these guys do. They're kind of weirdos, I'll be totally honest. And the intellectual dark web is super weird. These are weird people. But who are these people?
Okay.
If we had to make a composite, who are these people? What is a rationalist?
Okay, well, I think it's very simple, and again, I think the story speaks for itself. It doesn't say all Silicon Valley think this; it says many Silicon Valley leaders, right? In the deck, as we call it, like the subhead of the story, it's a subsection. But the way I've been describing it to people is, we tend to think about the world in terms of liberals and conservatives. We as human beings, we like absolutes.
Left and
we
right.
like left and right. Well,
red and blue.
To paraphrase my favorite playwright, Tom Stoppard, this story is about the third thing when you thought there were only two. Okay? It's this third group that is somewhere in between those two, in between left and right. And what it's about is, people who might seem progressive, might seem liberal, and they are in many ways.
Socially liberal, right?
Right. But they had this belief that any idea should be, should have a space. Any idea should be discussed, no matter how extreme. And there are people in my story who are on the record, saying this, right? That even if you venture into like anti-feminist thought, or if you venture into race science, we should be allowed to go there, they say, right? We should be allowed to discuss this, especially in Silicon Valley. We're about disrupting, and we have to have...
So their thesis is we should talk about difficult topics, even if they are outside the Overton window.
And sometimes those topics are really outside the Overton window. And so one of the reasons that the Slate Star Codex blog was a nice window into this is, you can read the blog, as sort of a, something you sort of dive into here and there. You might get a link, you read it. That's not going to give you the full picture. If you go into the comments, okay, it's a different world.
Yeah, they're anonymous. They're pseudo-anonymous. Yeah.
But also, there are known white supremacists, like names known eugenicists, right? It's like this. You do get these really extreme views, and so then it becomes a question of,
do those people write comments on the New York Times?
Oh well, it's I'm sure that they do, but this is different, right? There is a
how is it different?
I'll tell you. It's a real conservative, and this is where the rationalists come in. It's sort of this global, society, let's call them. But they really believe in this notion that you should give everyone their say. So there's this concerted effort to do that, right? I've talked to so many people inside this community, on the fringes of the community, right? They really believe in this, that everyone should have their voice, and you see this time and again where in these other Silicon Valley groups, they make an effort, to give these extreme voices their due.
Are you saying that they don't just allow extreme voices like the New York Times does? Clearly, it's a comment section. That they might actually encourage those or in some way endorse them?
Well, definitely encourage like all voices, right? And this came out in
so they believe everybody should have a voice.
Everybody should have a voice.
Does the New York Times believe everybody should have a voice?
Of course, we believe everybody should have a voice.
What's the difference
right?
then? What's the difference?
Well, there are all sorts of differences, right?
Is the difference here that you don't like those voices?
No, absolutely not.
Is it the amount of those voices versus the amount of them on a percentage basis versus the New York Times? In other words, they have a lot of people who are racist. They have a lot of people who are sexist. They have a lot of people who want to talk about intelligence being inherited or a trait rather than a learned behavior. And the New York Times has less of them. So it's the percentage that disturbs you when you read it?
No, it's not necessarily about percentage either, right?
Okay.
The New York Times job is different, right? We're journalists. We're looking at the world, right? We are not trying to cultivate a particular point of view, or cultivate.
The New York Times is not looking to cultivate a point of view.
My job is to give people an understanding of what is going on in the world, right? So, whether it's what's going on with you as a podcaster and investor, or what's going on with this blog. My aim is to look at that, right?
Except for the opinion page, which is absolutely encouraging people to have opinions and a diversity of opinions.
And that's separate from me.
The opinion page of the New York Times does have a perspective. You pick who you want for president. You pick who you're going to fight for, or you'll pick winners and losers on that page, just like this blog will, and you'll have a range of comments. But so this blog is very similar to the opinion page, but your reporting and the reporting in the newsroom is very different.
It's
just
very
so we're
different.
Clear.
And
I agree with you on all this. And the reason I'm asking this in a very concise way is because I'm just trying to unpack exactly.
I think it's good. It's good. And let me add one thing is you're right. There are some cases where the New York Times will have an editorial, right? The editorial board on the opinion side will give their opinion, but then we have other voices that we ask in, right? All sorts of people.
Except for the right-wing ones, which you can't seem to keep at the paper. Any thoughts on that?
Again, that's not my area. I'm in the newsroom.
It would make your job easier if they could have at least 25% of the opinion page be right wing or, leaning right. Wouldn't that be helpful in terms of this discussion?
My job is hard no matter what. And I'm glad it's hard. And that's the way. And it gets harder. Let me tell you, it gets harder. We can go into that. The job is just hard, especially in this world we're living in of social media. And it's hard for a lot of them.
And facts being debatable. And the search for truth is hard because the algorithms push to the top of the feed whatever is the most engaged, not whatever is the most truthful.
And, and there are reporters who have it a whole lot harder than me. So look, I have no complaints. I'm at the job. I have the job that I want.
This Week in Startups is brought to you by our friends at DigitalOcean and their app platform. This is a new platform as a service solution to build modern cloud native apps. With App Platform, you can build, deploy, and scale apps and static websites quickly and easily. Simply point your GitHub repository and let the App Platform do all the heavy lifting. Since DigitalOcean runs App Platform on their own infrastructure, your costs will be significantly lower than with any other product, and no big price jumps as you scale, right? You're not going to get that surprise bill. It's built on top of DigitalOcean Kubernetes. If you're a developer or you're in tech, you know what that means. If you don't, look it up. It's Kubernetes, and that provides a smoother migration path so you can take more control of your infrastructure setup. There are 3 basic tiers: Starter, Basic, and Professional. Starter is great for basic sites. Basic is better for prototyping apps, and Professional works best for production apps. Use App Platform for free and receive a $100 credit for any upgrade at do.co/twist. Do, as in DigitalOcean.co/twist. Okay, so this blog exists. It's fascinating. There's a range of outside the Overton window. This makes it the perfect story for a journalist to talk about. It's absolutely fair game. And then comes the collision point. The author, who was anonymous on his blog, but maybe not that hard to figure out who it was, had safety concerns for his lifestyle and, the content being outside the Overton window. And thus the debate starts of, should the person be named in the New York Times? Like you and I are named on this podcast, or you are bylined. This person has chosen to be anonymous. Why did you insist upon, or the New York Times? Well, I think it's you who insisted because it's your piece. And you could have bowed out and not have published the piece. So why did you insist on including his real name, despite the fact that he asked you and begged you to please not do it? And not only did he beg you and plead with you not to do it, he turned off his entire blog in protest because of his safety concerns. Why did the New York Times and why did you, Cade, decide that you had to print his name?
Well, this is complicated. And let's say, let me just ask you one question before I go on. How do you know that all that happened?
Well, factually, I know he took his blog down, and I know that he took it down because of the story. Those are just observable facts. He said it. I know that he has an alternative lifestyle because he said it. I know that you all printed it. So the assumption I'm making here is that you didn't quit the New York Times over it. And you didn't publicly, to the best of my knowledge, object to his name being printed there. So then I assume by the fact that you didn't quit the New York Times over it, take your name off the piece, that in fact, if you left your name on the piece and you still work at the New York Times, that you would endorse it.
Okay, well...
Is that logical? Because that's how any logical person would look at it in my mind.
All right, well, let me just go back.
What am I missing?
Let me just go back to ground zero and we can talk about this because there is a difference, of worldview here, right? So I'm working on this story. You're right. He is pseudonymous on the blog. Okay. but his real name has been shared for years. Okay. Inside the communities that follow this, everybody knows his name. It's been shared online. He had even published one of his blog posts in a science journal under his own name. And I told him this, when I finally sat down to find his name, it took me a matter of minutes. Like like when you did the Google autocomplete, like his full name was in the Google autocomplete, right? So
not too hard to find.
It's not too hard.
He has safety concerns, and he told you those. And you decide, okay.
Hold on. We take the safety concerns very seriously, right? And let me tell you, we understand safety concerns, and that is always a discussion, right? People often say, you can't put my name in the story, or you can't make me the lead of the story, et cetera.
It's not your choice. It's not your choice.
Because there are safety concerns. Do we take that seriously? Absolutely. And we have conversations constantly about that. Is there a safety concern here, right? For lots of people involved.
Do you think he has a valid safety concern? What was your determination in this case? Because I know your editors were involved in it. This is a very controversial case. So this must have gone to the top of the New York Times. What was the top of the New York Times position on this and his safety?
I will tell you, so what happened though, let's get this right. Like what happened though is I went to him, right? Once, people started to tell him about the story I was pulling together, and I thought, well, I need to contact him at this point.
Yeah, they're back channeling it, sure.
Yeah, and so I thought I needed to contact him and see if, we could talk and,
it's the right thing to do, yeah.
Get an interview, meet him,
Perfect.
sit down with him. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you what he said because he has to go off the record, and I need to respect that, but I can tell you what I said, okay? And on my side of the conversation, what I said is, I could not guarantee that his name would not be in the paper. In saying that, I tried to meet with him and talk this through and try to understand all the issues. But, what happened is that he took down his blog. And at this point, I have not published a story, right? I'm just researching the story.
Right. But he goes nuclear. He pushes the nuclear button.
Right. And so, he took down the blog and he said it was because of X, Y, and Z. Okay.
X, Y, and Z being you in the New York Times doing the story and outing him and his personal safety.
Right. But it's phrased in a certain way, right? It said that I threatened to dox him. I did not threaten anyone. I did not threaten to dox anyone. His name was already out there. Doxing has a particular meaning. Some people think it means something different. But, what we feel strongly about...
Doxing, for people who don't know, is sharing somebody's specific address. And in this case, revealing a pseudonym isn't exactly doxing, but I guess the second order impact could be it could lead to doxing. I think that's the most accurate way to say it, right?
Yeah. But in any event, it's cut and dry.
Do you understand when you said to him, I'm writing a story and I can't guarantee your name won't be in it, but let's talk. Do you not see that could be interpreted as a threat that if you don't talk to me and then you put in the same sentence that I can't guarantee it? Well, if you're the writer, why can't you guarantee it?
Well, because at the Times, we're practicing journalism, right? My aim is to show you what's going on in the world. And if someone is worthy of a story, if they have influence, and let me tell you, there is influence here. And you could see that in the reaction to him taking down his blog, right? And you could see it then. I didn't even publish a story, and there was a huge reaction. And there was a reaction when I did publish, right? And if someone, is worthy of a story, we can't just leave out facts that are right there, out there in the open, right?
Got it.
And other people
it would look like you were to say it another way, it would look like the New York Times made a rule for Scott that they hadn't made for other people who had made the same request to remain anonymous.
Well, we're just doing our job. And then amidst that, right, we think about safety concerns. We absolutely think about safety concerns.
What was your assessment, or what was the final assessment? Would he be unsafe because of the writing of this? Or do you think he was overreacting and using that as a technique to intimidate you?
Well,
saying, I'm going to dox, you're doxing me, and using that term then makes it look like you're a savage who wants him to be attacked.
I'm not going to tell you what our conversations were inside the Times, but this is cut and dry. But what I will say is that, when
it's cut and dry that he's a public figure with great influence, therefore he doesn't get privacy.
Well, also,
he's given up his privacy by being a public figure. If you write a book or you host a podcast, you are now a public figure. That's the determination you guys came to. I'm sure of it.
Hold on. Also, and somehow it gets left out. We didn't publish the story till 6 months later or more. He had already relaunched his blog and given his own name in the blog.
Right.
Okay.
So do you think do you think his whole nuclear thing with you was sincere, or he was doing this to kind of undermine your piece?
I have no idea. But that's
the right answer. You can't get in his mind.
But I can't get in his mind. I can't get in anybody's mind that I write about. But what I do know is that he published his own name on his new blog, and then we published his story. And so we certainly did not dox him. He had already published his own name. Again, the internet is a complicated place, and
I think we've spelled it out pretty clearly here. The order of events.
Right.
Your piece did not come out with his name until then. He reacted in a way that he felt was best for him, which is to take his blog down and not have people linking to it. And he said, well, if it's going to come out anyway, I might as well own it and have my name come out. Do you think he's racist?
Again, I can't get inside anyone's head.
Okay, do you think the things he's written are racist?
The story is not. This is the other thing. The story is about this mindset where you allow any idea, right? Some people think that is absolutely fine, and they're really intent on making that happen. Other people think that there's a real risk there, and that you can lead people to extremist views if you're giving airspace to those extreme views, right?
So now I see it. So by creating a forum where anybody can talk about even the most controversial topics, the bell curve comes to mind. Charles Murray's book, in a claim in that book, I believe most accurately, is that there was a difference between the IQs of different by race. And it was a slight difference. And they talked about that. And if you talk about that, it might encourage people to think that Black people are less intelligent than white people.
Think about it like this.
Is that the position people have? Is that by creating that forum for that discussion, you are encouraging people to then go to their worst demons and maybe exacerbating some racist tendencies?
Right. Some people are concerned about that, and it's not limited to this blog. There are other situations where this happens. For instance, like there's this new publication, Quillette, right? And
yes,
they will publish a wide range of things, but some of it is in this very area you're talking about. And so, that's the concern. And there's a really interesting study on this. There's a researcher based in Switzerland who I quote in the story. And he's done this really interesting study where he looks at people who would view YouTube videos from the so-called intellectual dark web, right? These
Eric Weinstein,
right.
Sam Harris, who was never part of it, who's a personal friend of mine. We have the same book agent. We've been friends for a decade. He said, I don't want to be part of the intellectual dark web. Thank you. No, thank you. But those folks then lead to other folks.
What the study shows is that people who viewed those videos, it was kind of an on-ramp to more extreme videos on YouTube. They could track it, right?
Right.
User by user, and that's the type of concern that is discussed in my piece.
Whose fault is that? Because now this dovetails with your new book.
Whose fault
is it that a perfectly reasonable Sam Harris, who is incredibly intellectual, incredibly fair-minded and rational, then leads to Ben Shapiro, who then leads to InfoWars, right? Like this is what people are claiming the algorithm does. It takes somebody from, the New York Times, then it hops to one of the subjects, maybe Slate Codex, maybe, a Sam Harris video. Then that leads to an Eric Weinstein video, which leads to an InfoWars video, and then down the rabbit hole you go.
Well, these are like the biggest questions of our time, right? This is why I wrote the article.
In your research, who sends people down that rabbit hole? It's a very easy answer. Well, it's not Sam Harris. It's not Eric Weinstein.
Well, there are lots of factors here, right? It's, and I'm looking at this writ large, but I think, what you're saying is that there are people involved, there are technologies involved, right? We're talking about a vast ecosystem here. And you're right. In my book, this is one of the things I get into. And not just with this question, but so many other questions about where our world is moving when you mix in this increasingly complicated technology, and not just increasingly complicated, but technology that where it's hard to understand what is happening, right?
You're speaking specifically of the algorithm and how the recommended videos on the right-hand side of YouTube serve up the next piece of content. Anybody who has listened to an Eric Weinstein video or Lex Friedman interviewing Eric Weinstein, we'll see on the right hand Ben Shapiro interviewing Eric Weinstein. Now, Ben Shapiro, who is a devout Jew, doesn't believe in transgender, doesn't believe in gay marriage, etc. Based on what he said, I've listened to his podcast. He's pretty devout religious. So you have scientists talking about science, and then Ben Shapiro maybe overlaps a little bit, or he's interested in their topic, and then InfoWars maybe, or Dave Rubin kind of overlaps there, and Cernovich, and then all of a sudden you're on an InfoWars page or something even more pernicious, and that's all done by the algorithm, correct?
Well, look, I think you raise a good point here, but what interests me here is how ideas spread from person to person, and they can spread in lots of ways. They spread through technology, and they spread in other ways. We tend to believe, what's around us, right? And now what is around us is, the space is so vast, right? And technology enhances that. So when you use Twitter, Twitter is a part of what's going on there, but also all the people around you are part of that, and what they are saying and how many of them there are, right? Yep. And there are just countless ways, and you see this whether you're a journalist or a VC. If you're in Twitter, you're inside this bubble where you can think that is the sole reality, and it's hard to step outside that and realize that that's just a small subset of what's going on, and the world is bigger than that. It's not just about technology; it's about the blending of technology and people and what they're saying.
So there are two vectors here, if I'm parsing this correctly. You have the content being created. It has adjacencies, as it would. I mean, a New York Times story might lead people to, something further left, like MSNBC, which might lead somebody to something completely socialist. And then that might lead somebody to something completely communist. Are you a communist?
No, I'm not.
But are you a socialist?
Again, I don't think my political views are relevant here.
Okay, I'm going to guess you're on the left, but we both live in the Bay Area. It's kind of we both live in California. Sorry if that's doxing you, I could beep it out, but I think it's on your byline.
It's all good.
We both live on the West Coast. We're both we're closer to the Pacific than the Atlantic.
Right.
Please don't show up at our houses.
Right.
But to the left of you is communism. And then to the left of communism is suffering and pain and authoritarianism, and communism is authoritarianism. So you could go further left too. People could wind up reading, what's the socialist publication? Jacob something? It's like a magazine, Jacobs. Anyways, now I'm going down that rabbit hole to the left because of the Twitter algorithm, because I think socialism and communism is garbage. Jacobin. Yeah, Jacobin. I would have never known about that, but I started mixing it up with the AOC crowd, which then goes to the left a little bit more. So you can go left on this journey, can't you? As well as right?
Of course you can, right?
Okay, just so we're clear.
But there's also let's talk about just all the misinformation that gets spewed on a daily basis. And that's a huge problem as well. It's not just about, moving to one side or the other based on the facts you're seeing. It's based on all the misinformation that gets spread. And, what's really interesting, and this, is only just part of what my book gets into, is, these AI technologies that are making it easier and easier and easier for machines to generate the misinformation, to generate, images that look like the real thing, videos, as well as tweets, blog posts. And it's not perfect yet, right? But we're moving towards a world where it's going to be so hard to tell if anything is real or not, whether it's the written word or whether it's an image. And if you think we have problems now with this, as the technology improves,
it's going to get worse.
It's a whole different problem.
So we have the algorithm sending you down a rabbit hole, and we know the more extreme a view is, the more energy emotionally it triggers inside of you, the greater the chances that you will watch more. We know this just from outrage culture, which we used to call it in the 80s or 90s. People who hated Howard Stern would keep listening because they wanted to hear what he would say next. The same with that reality television, right? The more outrageous, the more you tune in. So if somebody does something completely offensive, oh my God, we're all going to talk about it. And obviously Trump was part of that playbook, which he stole from Howard Stern. That was a whole thing in and of itself. And now we see the algorithms understand that part of human nature, which is the more emotion that is elicited by a headline that you may or may not write. And on the YouTube side, which is just the best example of it, I think, is if they're going to suggest a video after you watch an Eric Weinstein, Lex Friedman video where they're talking completely intellectually about something, if they had the choice of sending you to an MIT courseware on AI video or an AI video about AI taking over the planet and, Terminator, or, some intellectual dark web video, they're going to show you the one that elicits the most emotion, because in their selfish purposes, I remember in the early days of YouTube, they said, all we care about is time on site. That's our North Star metric. All the algorithms are told to increase the number of minutes you watch. They told me that. And Zuckerberg was very clear about that. We just want you to engage more, post more, read more, log in more. Isn't that the core of the issue here, is that we've given over to the algorithm curation?
Well, I think it's one of the issues, honestly. Like the way.
Is there any issue bigger than that? That seems to me to be the number one issue.
No, there are so many issues, right? In that.
What's a bigger issue than that?
Well, again, it's not just about the technology. It's about the people. And it's so easy to say, right? I'm just doing this, right? My intentions are good. And this goes for the leaders of the companies, the people who are generating the content, whoever you want. You can say, I am just doing X, okay? And I care deeply about this, and I don't want to cause problems. But you have to think about the consequences, right? We live in this world where there are consequences to our actions, and in ways that we don't always expect, right?
Got it. Unintended consequences of the content we produce.
Right. Whether it's personal or whether it's a company, right? We all have to think about this stuff. And it's very easy to try to compartmentalize and say, I'm just doing this in this tiny portion of the universe. But there are all sorts of people and technologies to think about, and forces. And you can't just say, it's just about the technology, or it's just about like the data, or just about rational thought. There are emotional truths and historical truths that need to be thought about, political truths.
You know what I just realized as well, we're having this discussion, there's the algorithm, but then there is also the grifter crowd. There's a group of people who know that being in the InfoWars zone of conspiracy theory is a great grift. If you talk about conspiracy theories, you will get more page views. You will get more ads. You will sell more product. So there's actually even more pernicious aspect to this. Not only do you have the algorithm sending people down the rabbit hole, if it is sending you down the rabbit hole, those people get rewarded with more money. And therein becomes this like crazy devil's bargain where you kind of start leaning towards that. I mean, I literally tweeted myself with red eyes, the Bitcoin image. I just retweeted it to get the Bitcoin people out of my social feed because they felt I was too critical of Bitcoin and they were bullying me. I was being bullied because I said Bitcoin is very speculative, and chances are it'll be replaced with a better technology. I mean, you're talking about thousands of tweets, very personal, like you're fat, your hairline's receding, you're ugly, you're dumb. And I'm like, okay, I know this is stuff I know. Like I've got a mirror. Like I have my transcripts. I know I'm not the smartest guy in the class, but I just tweeted the image to get those people off my back. But there are other people who are tweeting those images, in other words, to make money, right? There's a bit of a grift going on here, I believe.
I think you make a great point, right? There are some people who, their intentions are good. They just get caught up in it. There are other people who are, actively trying to grab hold of that, right? Yep. And use it. Of course. And sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between one and the other. Right? How do you get inside someone's head?
Now you're talking about intent, which was where we started. Like, did you intend to dox him, or did he intend to blow it up to make you bad? You can't read in somebody's mind.
You can't get inside someone's head. That I know.
Let me ask a question that's come up a bunch. Scott, who's writing this blog, he has to be subject to public scrutiny if he's going to put himself in the arena and write blog posts. We all agree on that. He's a public figure, and there's no way around it.
Some people don't agree with you, but I hear you.
I mean, it's unrealistic that the president of the United States or a New York Times journalist or a podcaster has to own their words, and somebody who's massively influential with millions of people reading them every month doesn't have to own their words. You don't get a free pass on being a public figure, even if you use a pseudonym, in my mind. So journalists, too, should be prepared to be under scrutiny. You certainly are prepared to be under scrutiny when you have a byline, correct?
Absolutely.
So why then is the New York Times so offended by Taylor Lorenz being called out by another journalist, Tucker Carlson, to the extent that they feel they need to write a public statement about it and tell him to stop harassing her? Why is it harassment when she is held accountable for misattributing quotes, and the New York Times feels the need to come to her defense?
Again, that's not my area. I'm a reporter at the New York Times. I've only just recently gotten to know Taylor. And as far as statements, you're gonna have to ask somebody else about that. Because I'm a reporter.
Got it. Way to deflect that one. Well, I mean, I understand that you have to, but said another way, journalists should be prepared, if you're going to be a journalist, putting her aside and Tucker aside, because I think both of them are, to be totally honest, self-absorbed and like the attention. They wouldn't be full contact on social media. Like Taylor would not be attacking people all day long on social media if she didn't want attention. Now, that doesn't mean she wants harassment, but she could very easily do what many journalists do, which is don't have a social media presence and just retreat from that, or have a pseudonym and just be on servers without people knowing it's her.
Hold on. Here's what I will say, right? Harassment online is a huge, huge problem. And it comes from so many different sources, from so many different directions. And it is intense, and in some cases, it is really, really horrible and scary.
What was your life like after the Star's blog came down? Did you get death threats? Did you have personal safety concerns?
Well, let's put it this way, right? I have no reason to complain. There are, colleagues of mine at the Times who are far more talented than I am, who get this so much more than I did, right? It's intense. And, a lot of people get it all the time. And, that's just a fact. And, so many other people in the world are getting this, and it's a real thing. And if you haven't experienced it, it's hard to understand until you have.
I think it's a very astute point. I had a death threat last week. I've had 3 stalkers. I've had people show up at my office, and generally they fall into the, mentally ill or incredibly effervescent, really major fans who just don't have who have boundary issues, right? So there's like a boundary issue, but then there's also like I literally got a death threat last week from Australia, and I'm talking to the Australian authorities about how credible this developer, who's apparently somewhat high profile, and they're like, in our country, we don't have laws against people saying they want to kill you or shoot you, which is what the person said to me. I literally had somebody dox my address and pictures of my house over the July 4th weekend. And they were a private equity person in New York who just disagreed with something I said. In fact, it was over me criticizing Taylor Lorenz. I had criticized one of her pieces where she said on Twitter that like people were being ridiculous that they were going to work and how selfish that was. And I was like, unless you have a family and you don't have a job and you go to work during a pandemic, in that case, that's okay. And you work behind a keyboard, so it's really not cool of you to dunk on poor people who have to drive buses, to take you to work. And then somebody literally doxed me. I mean, this stuff gets crazy. And for women, I do know it's 10 times worse. But all journalists are subject to this. And there's no reasonable world where a journalist could use a pseudonym, right? I mean, it would be...
Yeah. I mean, and...
How would that even work? I mean, like, you have to own your words.
Right. I mean, we live in complicated times, right? And I think journalism is sort of an extreme version of what I think everybody should go through, and hopefully does, right? You sit down and you think about what you've seen and what you've heard, and you reach a decision and you act on it, right? And hopefully you stand behind it, and that's certainly what we aim to do.
What gave you the idea for the book? Was there like a moment in time, a spark that made you feel you had to write this book?
The book, I started work on it when I came back from Seoul, South Korea. I traveled to Seoul in 2016 when DeepMind, the AI lab in London owned by Google, built a machine to play the ancient game of Go. And they took it to Seoul to take on Lee Sedol, who was the best Go player of the past decade. And Go is like an ancient game that is far more complicated, exponentially more complicated than chess. And people thought that a machine that could beat one of the best players in the world at Go was still decades away. And that week, when that machine defeated Lee Sedol, and I keep saying this to people who ask me about it, it was one of the most amazing weeks of my life. And I was not a participant. I was just an observer. It was unbelievable. The whole country and vast swaths of Asia, China and Japan were focused on this. And you could feel, being in Seoul, you could feel the whole country sort of ebb and sway, ebb and flow with this match. And it was an inflection point for AI technology. And when I got back, what I really wanted to do was write about the people building this.
DeepMind.
Well, I wanted to write about Dimas Hassabis, who's one of the DeepMind founders, who's an incredible person. And so he became one of the characters. But then as I started, I sold the book to my publisher, and as I started to write it...
Who's the publisher on this?
It's Penguin Random House.
Great.
And
nice.
It comes out tomorrow, March the 16th.
Perfect. Everybody go buy it. You know what to do if you're in the audience. Go buy it.
I appreciate it, but it really ended up being about these incredible people, these largely academics who believed in this one idea that's driving most of our AI technology. They believed in it for decades when no one else did, right?
Yeah, and they were based out of Europe, right? They were in London, and they were like a dozen academics. And I remember Elon told me he had funded them, and then Larry Page funded them. And they got to some crossroads. I don't know if you cover this in the book, the history of it.
It's all in the book about how all this plays out with Page and with Elon Musk. And
because Elon, I don't know if this is public, but he really tried to convince them to not sell. And he offered them a large amount of money to not sell to Google and stay independent.
Interesting. Well,
not in the book.
we that's not in my reporting, but there's a lot in there that is. And it's not just DeepMind. The central character became this guy named Jeff Hinton, who's a generation older than Dimas, who believed in the idea of a neural network from the early 70s. And this is an idea that drives, face recognition, the speech recognition on Siri and your iPhone. It's essential to self-driving cars. What robotics are doing nowadays, the list goes on. All this technology we talked about that can generate images and generate tweets and blog posts. It's all, based on this one idea. And Jeff was one of the few people on Earth who believed in this idea. For decades when no one else did, and then it started to work around 2010. And there's this incredible moment when it starts to work and the biggest companies on earth realize it, and Jeff auctions his services off, the services of himself and 2 of his students, to the highest bidder. And we're talking about some of the biggest companies on earth: Google, Microsoft, a major player in China. China was involved from the beginning.
Yep.
And we're
talking about tens of millions of dollars
for three people. 3 people.
Wow.
And that set the price for the talent. And
everybody knows AI people who are developers who are worth their salt get paid low millions of dollars, $1, $2, $3 million a year.
Yes, that's the moment when the price was set, and it just went up from there. And it's fascinating to watch an entire industry see, this what would seem to be this obscure mathematical idea working, and then like going all in on it, right? And one company will ante up, and then you've got Facebook coming in, right? And they're raising, and it's really interesting how this industry works.
And then who is, in your estimation, because Go was, for people who don't know Go and why it's so complicated, this is a game where stones, just consider them like checkers, black and white ones. They're on a grid of 19 by 19, I believe. So it's 361 pins. And when you put 2 different colors on either end of a line, it flips to that color. The number of permutations, this cannot be brute forced. It is not a brute force type AI, which chess is. Chess is a finite game. All the pieces are known, and it's a very small grid. Poker also has some misinformation because you don't know what 2 cards you're holding versus the 2 cards I'm holding. So there's also bluffing, which is another weird thing to put in a game. That bluffing actually works. So how does a computer know to try a bluff? Is that person going to call them down or not with a weak hand? It's very hard to know the randomness of that. But solving Go, we were very far off in terms of our estimation of when Go would be beat, right?
You're exactly right. And you raise a great point. The best Go players in the world play by intuition, right? They can't look too far ahead. You're right, because the game doesn't work that way.
It's too big for the human mind.
And so if you're going to build a machine that can beat the best players, you at least have to mimic that human intuition, right? They make moves based on feel, the top players do. And you can make a move, in the middle of the game, it'll have repercussions like dozens of moves later. I compared to geopolitics, right? Where one tiny thing will happen in one part of the world, and that will have a knock-on effect years later.
One vendor has their fruit stand seized upon, which I think was that the Egyptian revolution that was based upon that?
I don't know.
One of the Middle East revolutions, I remember the whole awakening in that specific country was because somebody who was a vendor had their fruit stand taken from because they didn't have an official license, and the person, I think, then did an act of self-immolation, in protest, and then that ripple then created an entire revolution, which is what happens in human rights, or actually George Floyd would be the perfect example of it. Like we haven't confronted Black Lives Matter and that whole movement and equality, and I just had I had 2 different African American and venture capitalists on my podcast recently. And they both pointed to the George Floyd moment as the moment that people and LPs took them more seriously as venture capitalists.
That's really fascinating. And
I was like, what? It took a murder? And I asked them to explain, and they were like, yeah, I think it was when they saw a 9-minute murder occur in front of them, they just couldn't deny it anymore. And it just made them say things have to change.
It's a really interesting thing that you bring up, and like there's a prime example of this in the book as well. This guy Jeff Hinton I talked about, right? Who he had this idea that he was one of the few on earth who really nurtured this idea that would become so important decades later. In the 80s, he is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. He'd immigrated from England, okay, and there came a point where he realized the only way to do AI research was to take money from Ronald Reagan's Defense Department. And he did not want to do that. He and his wife did not want to do that. They left the country, and he went to the University of Toronto. Okay. The reason there were no neural network researchers, meaning, important AI researchers in the US in 2010 when all this started to work, is because he made that decision.
Wow.
And
how fateful.
It's incredible. So the center of gravity for this research was in Canada, and it was in Europe, as you said. It was not in the US. And so then it hits like 2 decades later, and all these giant, U.S. tech companies have to go elsewhere for the talent. It's a fascinating thing.
What do you think is the end game for corporations and AI? What are they so enamored with that they are willing to fight in that auction and put so much behind it? What do you think they're trying to solve?
They're trying to solve everything. So think about this, right? This one idea. It works with facial recognition technology, right? It's what drives Google Photos, right? Where it can recognize what's in your pictures and you can sort them. Simple things like that, right? Siri now works with this idea. That's why it can recognize what you say. You need it for self-driving cars, so it can recognize pedestrians, street signs, line markings on the road. Flying drones, like self-flying drones, that you need that type of image recognition. And we now have these giant language models, they call them, like GPT-3, which came out of OpenAI, this lab that Elon Musk helped found. What this system does is it's a giant neural network. A neural network is just a mathematical system that looks for patterns in data. So what you do is you take this neural network, and for months, you give it Wikipedia articles, self-published books, all sorts of other content from the internet. It learns to recognize the patterns in the English language. It learns, how to piece language together, right? That means it can generate tweets, like I said, blog posts. It can learn to carry on a conversation.
What could go wrong?
Right, what could go wrong, but also
everything.
Everything can go wrong, but also it is vitally important to the future of Google. Like if you want to build a chatbot, if you want to improve your search engine, like this technology is already helping to drive the search engine. So there's this force on the one hand, that is forcing this technology into the heart of Google. And on the other hand, there are all these problems, problems of bias against women and people of color, as well as the disinformation.
And you're not just saying that as like virtue signaling New York Times writer. It literally, if there is racism on the internet or systematic bias in the Wikipedia, because it's edited by a bunch of white graduate students in England, or, like that whole group of Wikipedia editors, wherever they came from in Jimmy Wales' circle, became the predominant editors. Now it's going to, because the data set was biased in, biased out. Is that the bottom line?
You are spot on, right? We as humans are flawed. We have biases, right? And we exhibit those biases on the internet all the time. And so this system is going to pick those up. And a really good example is, people have shown this with these systems. If you start talking about a programmer, it always refers to the programmer as he.
Sure.
Right? And it applies the female pronoun to other things. It's subtle biases like that. And then, you get toxicity as well, right? Hate speech, comes out of these systems. And we've seen that before. And we're going to see it again unless these
Why would we think anything differently? I mean, it's like, it's in one way it's surprising, and in another way it's just confirming. Like look at the history of cinema. If we gave it the entire history of cinema, you would, and the Overton window is opening and closing during that whole arc of the 100 years of cinema that we've experienced, you're going to have some, things said in Blazing Saddles that wouldn't be said in the 40-year-old version, but then maybe South Park would say 10 times worse. You're going to have this ebb and flow of politically incorrectness or comedy or racism. And the machine is not going to know the difference. Is there something like Go that they didn't think would fall that you think in your research for the book is going to fall now?
There's one that fell this past year, and this is probably the most important result of the decade. DeepMind, who we talked about, who built that Go machine and had that really impressive result, but it's a game, right? A game is not real life. They had a result this past year, end of 2020. Their system is called AlphaFold. And
Sure.
they cracked what's called the protein folding problem. And this is a problem that biological scientists have worked on for decades, and that they didn't think would fall for decades to come, just like the Go problem. anyone who has lived over the past year can relate to this and why this is important. The protein folding problem can help us repurpose medicines that we have, apply them to new diseases and viruses. It can help us develop vaccines. It can accelerate this process. And them having solved this problem, this biological sciences problem, might make it easier for us to deal with the next pandemic. And if we've got medicines that have been approved by the FDA for other things, we can better understand and more quickly.
Yeah, so AlphaFold is just amazing. And by the way, if you go to DeepMind's website, they got a huge, they publish a lot of this.
They do.
I noticed that Sam Altman from OpenAI said they were going to stop publishing some of their work because they felt it could be dangerous. Who owns these innovations? Are they patentable, trademarkable, or are these all going to eventually be commoditized, like computer chips and memory and cameras are commoditized? Or will we see one company win it all, in your estimation?
This is another great question, and it's so interesting to me, and this is a real thread throughout the book. Like I said, it was academics like Jeff Hinton, who worked on these ideas, and then they were sucked into industry. And what that meant is they brought an academic sensibility to this work. Academics published their research. And the big companies started doing that. So all this AI stuff, they openly publish it, which means everyone has access to it. So the currency now in this field is twofold. One, it's the data. Do you have enough data? Okay. Well, actually, there are three things. Do you have the data? Mm-hmm. Do you have the talent, the people who know how to do this? And do you have the processing power? And we're talking about a ton of processing power. So this type of stuff that Sam's working on, he got $1 billion in funding from Microsoft just so they can have enough processing power to do this stuff. So they got $1 billion
in cash from Microsoft or credits on their network?
It's promised. You know how these deals are. Who knows what the time horizon is?
$100 million over 10 years. Yeah.
Right. But it's a lot of money.
It's a big number up front.
And it's not the kind of money that everybody has. And what it's about is building these giant data centers, essentially, that can process all that stuff. There are not going to be a lot of companies or organizations on Earth that can do that. So at least in the near term.
That's interesting. So Google has all the search information and intent. Facebook has everybody's behaviors and personal information. Tesla has all those cars and all the data, or Uber has that as well with their apps, on the phones. They have that massive data set. So the data set plus the talent, let's assume there's a lot of talent in the world, not infinite, but there's enough to spread around. There's going to be pockets of data that each person owns. And then the compute platforms, Amazon has a big one, Google has a big one, and I guess you can buy them. Microsoft has a big one. Is there going to be a moment where they are able to brute force certain things like, say, cracking Bitcoin or cracking deep encryption levels? And did that come up in your research that this could unleash a level of security concerns and hacking that we have never seen before? And is AI being deployed by the Russians, Chinese in hacking efforts yet?
Well, that is a concern, but it's in a slightly different area. The concern there is with what they call quantum computing, right? And that's sort of a separate area. There's some overlap, but the real worry with a quantum computer is that if you can get there, and we're not there yet, the worry is that you can crack today's encryption. And that means you're going to need new types of encryption. Now, there are people who are also working on those new types, which also involve, quantum mechanics, right? This type of physics that drives a quantum computer. So it's another arms race. It's an enormous arms race.
Having written the book, Genius Makers, the Mavericks Who Brought AI to Google, Facebook, and the world, do you feel that this, bringing it back to the AI rationalists, where did you fall personally on the belief that we could have a cataclysmic AI event versus that being the stuff of science fiction?
So I'm fascinated by this whole dynamic. And it's, what I tell everybody is, very often in newspapers and, and the like, you get these headlines. We go back to headlines. You get these headlines that say, AI experts say. Well, AI experts are not a monolithic thing. And you have incredibly bright incredibly well-educated, top people in their field who believe that AGI, as they call it, a machine that can do anything the human brain can do, is right around the corner, and it's a huge danger. And then there are people who are equally well qualified and equally bright who think that's ridiculous. And it's really a belief, right?
General AI you're referring to.
Yeah, they call it artificial general intelligence, and
basically means thinks like a human.
Right, thinks like a human,
but a very powerful human.
Right, and it's really. The chapter in my story that goes into this, it's called religion, right? Because it's really about, do you believe in that idea or not? And again, it's so interesting.
Where did you come into the book with it? Where were you when you came into the book? Do you think it was farcical to think that would happen, or you just had an open mind to it as a possibility?
You know me. I'm a New York Times reporter. I stay out of this. I just observe. I observe.
Straight down the middle. You observed. Okay.
Here's what I will say, right? What's fascinating to me is none of us know what's going to happen in the future, obviously. We could have AGI in 5 minutes. There could be an announcement in 5 minutes, and it could be there.
It would do the announcing. It would take over all the radio stations and all the podcasts and replace it with its announcement.
Right. But because
people of Earth.
Right. Because we don't know, we can make any claim we want. And so that's the battle that you have. And you know this about Silicon Valley. If you're going to build something, whether it's Facebook or some piddly little app or AGI, you better believe in it.
You got to be delusional. Delusional, as I tell founders, is a superpower, because being delusional means you don't quit.
You got it.
If any rational person knew what it took to build a self-driving car, they would not start.
You got it. Now apply that to AGI, which is so much harder to do than a self-driving car, right? So it's the same playbook applied to something that is just astronomically more complicated.
The Chinese are, it's the CCP. It's a communist Chinese party. They have a different view of humanity, human rights, how people should be treated. Human rights organizations universally agree there is a genocide occurring with the Uyghurs in China at this very moment. And the Chinese have made it a national effort, I believe, to win the AI race. What did you learn about China's efforts? And then part two, when you put a communist country that is currently involved in the one genocide that we know of on the planet, like at scale genocide, like legitimate, plus AI, what concerns do you have?
Well, I learned a whole lot in writing this book. And one of the things I alluded to earlier is that China was involved in this race from the beginning, right? When I talked about Jeff Hinton auctioning his company off, Baidu was one of the companies bidding, right? The Google of China, they call it. And, that's worth remembering, right? China is a big player here. We talked about the talent being important and the data.
Oh boy,
China's a big country, right? So that means,
and they get all the data. There's no privacy in China.
Exactly, right?
Or on TikTok, lest you think.
And there are some just incredible characters in my book. Qi Lu, who's a China-born technologist who was one of the top executives at Microsoft. There's this incredible story about him and why he really left Microsoft. Let's just leave it at that. But others,
could have been influenced. Could he have been influenced by?
You can't believe the story. It's just like too good to even hint at here. Go read this.
I can't wait to read it. I mean, if you look at Jack Ma disappearing for 6 or 8 weeks, like the Chinese have a different view of the God King CEO than we do.
It's true. And the other thing that you mentioned, was, the situation, involving an ethnic minority, and AI plays right into this. One of my very, very talented colleagues, Paul Mosier, has covered this for the New York Times in Asia, right? Efforts to use face recognition technology, to identify this ethnic minority. And there are pointed ways of using this technology for surveillance, and in ways that concern a whole lot of people, right? And that's one issue. And there are lots of concerns here. Not just surveillance, but autonomous weapons. And we got to think about that too. If we ban autonomous weapons here,
it doesn't mean China's not going to build a tank that can drive itself and figure out which buildings to blow up.
Right.
And if you just think, I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Lives of Others about the Stasi.
Absolutely. What a great movie.
Great movie. But East Berlin, I forgot how much I enjoyed talking to you. God.
Oh, it's great. This is a great
It's a great conversation. If you just think about the Stasi with AI, like you're just listening to everybody. And then all of a sudden it's 1984, like everybody's got a device listening to their thought crimes, or a potential discussion occurs. And now the government's like, where are the hotspots for, people who believe in freedom of speech? And okay, then give me the network around that. Okay, bring them all in and let's have a little interrogation party, and then we'll get everybody to confess. This has really dark implications. Just meeting people, if they could know the proximity you are to a revolutionary, to somebody who's of a certain minority or a certain religion, and just your proximity to them could make you guilty. It gets back to the precogs in Minority Report. And I think AI could actually predict pretty well, if we know that people are led to a life of crime, and it starts with this indoctrination, a gang indoctrination, a mafia indoctrination, running small crimes, eventually becoming big ones. The precog concept is pretty obtainable by AI today.
Well, people are already deploying much simpler algorithms to try to do this type of thing in the justice system. We've written about this, and it's an issue today, and the algorithms are very simple. Once you start applying more complicated things, it gets more complicated, and then that's just one issue to think about here globally. And these are global issues, and they're complicated. People, again, like to think in absolutes, and that...
Yeah, no silver bullet here, no good and evil. There's just a spectrum.
Exactly. And let's not forget that, people will say, we need to close down our borders, say, to our, to talent from our rivals, because we're worried about, espionage. But then if we do that, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot, right? We need, as we've showed during this conversation, the U.S. needs foreign talent. It's essential to us, including Chinese talent. We
should be getting every Chinese great scientist into our university system, and then get their families over here and get them paid, get them stock options on a 5-year vest, and make it impossible for them to go home. We should take the approach that an authoritarian country would have to not make people leave. We have to take the capitalist approach with honey, not the stick and the shackles, but the honey and the stock options to get them to stay here. This is a national security concern. Pay them off with citizenship, equity, and a lifestyle of freedom and prosperity.
Again, let me tip my hat to my colleague, Paul Mosier. I was lucky enough to work on a story with him about this very thing. And we talk about, the complications here. And, I think it's, not a lot of people understand it, right? It's very easy to say, we don't want, researchers from X country coming in the U.S. It's not the right way to think.
No, we need to. Speaking of security, a honey trap would be good. Okay, as we wrap here, Andreessen Horowitz backs Substack and Clubhouse. Those two platforms are explicitly trying to steal journalists and make them independent. We have this tech versus media back and forth that you and I think can reasonably discuss, because I've got my feet on both sides of it, and you're a very reasonable person, and you're old school, kind of classic journalist. What is the vibe inside of journalist circles? Not your opinion, because you're very good about not having one and sticking to your knitting of being a reporter. But I'm curious, you had Balaji, who's been on my podcast a bunch of times. He's not at A16 anymore, but he had a quote in your story that was particularly gnarly, where he said, let's figure out what journalists, I think it was, if things get hot, it may be interesting to sick the dark enlightenment audience on a single vulnerable hostile reporter, to dox them and turn them inside out with hostile reporting sent to their advertisers' friends' contacts. You viewed that email. This is a correct email. You would not have printed otherwise, because that'd be massive liability, correct?
Oh, absolutely.
And this was an email that was to Curtis Yarvin, who is whatever, I guess, neo-reactionary. I didn't go to graduate school, so I don't understand what neo-reactionary means. But what is the vibe when you read that email and you realize, hey, Andreessen Horowitz and this group of people is in a war with you, and it's become so personal now that I believe they are backing Substack in Clubhouse explicitly, not just for the opportunity there, but to dismantle their adversaries in the press. Andreessen Horowitz is saying they're going to be doing publishing and they're going to hire reporters and they're going to create their own new press corps to replace what they believe is too critical of them. And they're doing it where it hurts most. They're trying to steal top reporters and make them independent. This is an explicit strategy in my mind. How do journalists at the New York Times or other places, back channel, back offices, when you're having cocktails or talking in whatever secret Slack room you're in, what is the vibe about Andreessen Horowitz's explicit efforts to attack journalism and dismantle it?
Well, again, you can't get inside someone's head, right? So I don't know.
But these are powerful people putting a lot of money out there.
But I can tell you what we have talked about recently. This has gone on for a long time, right? For years, parts of Silicon Valley have said, we need to build our own infrastructure to get our voice heard, and and it might be getting more extreme now, but this is an old thing, and how much of it is just
I never saw them offering cash money advances to dislodge journalists.
Right.
That's new.
Well, what I will say is that parts of the journalism industry, so to speak, are doing very well. Like the New York Times has
subscription business off the charts.
Subscription, right? It's not about clicks; it's about subscriptions, and there are other important papers that are moving in the same direction and are really healthy, right?
Yeah.
What really worries me, and I've noticed this recently as I kind of do publicity for my book, is that I went through like my old hometown newspaper in Raleigh, North Carolina, right? It's not doing as well. Like local journalism has dried up, and that's a real concern. And you might have some big players which are doing well, but we need more than that, right? We need a wide variety of journalism, and that's a concern. But, people are always going to, want to build their own ways of doing PR or whatever you want to call it, or journalism. That's just going to happen. It's happened for years.
There you have it, folks. 90 minutes with Cade Metz. Go buy Genius Makers, the Mavericks who brought AI to Google, Facebook, and the world. And thanks, you've been on the pod. This is your fourth appearance, if you didn't know. 2015, 2016, 2018 episodes, 573, 673, 808, where we just chopped up the news and talked about it. It's great knowing you. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And thank you for having like a reasonable discussion about these issues. I would like to see, now we're past the Trump derangement syndrome, sort of horrific thing the country went through. I'd like to see the tech industry and tech journalism maybe find a little common ground here. And I think part of it is the percentage of coverage. And I've just been asking journalists, like, maybe write about some of the companies doing good things, not just when we fuck up.
Right.
Just like, remember the old school profile of a cool company doing something fun? Like, can we get one of those for every 5 times we screw up? It's literally my entire life is like doing crisis management for whatever company I've invested in has had problems that year. Companies screw up. Buy the book, everybody. All right, man. I'll see you at Boy Chick Bagels. Maybe we'll get some bagels at some point.
Right on. It is a deal.
That New York. See, this is my faith in the New York Times has been renewed by you, and the fact that this story, which I thought was fake news and a fake headline and link bait, and I ordered the damn bagels from Boy Chick Bagels. And I have eaten a bagel and a half a day for 5 days. Amazing.
Now we get to the important subjects.
These are legit bagels.
Yeah.
I mean, you've had them. Boy Chick Bagels, you've had them.
I like I said, I'm a stone's throw from them right now. I might have to go right now and get me one.
I mean, I toasted up an egg bagel from there and a pumpernickel one. I put a little butter, a little cream cheese, got a little lox. I got some caper berries going. Amazing.
There you go.
Amazing. They did a good job. Whoever wrote that story at the New York Times.
Right on.
Great job. Right on. All right, we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.